The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Anaconda like a blade through silk. Staff Sergeant Marcus Bulldog Rodriguez jerked awake in the communications bunker, coffee spilling across classified maps as an encrypted transmission pierced the night. The voice on the other end was calm, almost conversational, but Rodriguez had been in theater long enough to recognize the particular brand of controlled panic that preceded catastrophe. Overwatch, this is Phantom 6. We are in the shit. I repeat, we are in the shit. Lieutenant Commander Jake Reaper Morrison's transmission from deep inside the Helmand Valley carried the weight of inevitability. His 12-man SEAL team had been inserted 48 hours earlier for what intelligence had classified as a routine HVT capture mission. High-value target. Simple designation for a Taliban commander whose bomb-making expertise had claimed 37 American lives in the past 6 months. Nothing about Afghanistan was ever routine. Rodriguez's fingers flew across the radio console, triangulating the signal. The coordinates placed Phantom 618 clicks northwest of the nearest friendly position, surrounded by terrain that tactical manuals euphemistically described as challenging. In reality, the Hindu Kush Mountains offered 1,000 places to die and precious few to survive. The valleys were graveyards lined with Soviet armor from a different war, different decade, same unforgiving landscape. Phantom 6, this is Overwatch. Send your traffic. Rodriguez's voice carried across continents, bouncing off satellites and through encrypted channels to reach Morrison's team, now pinned down in a compound that had transformed from objective to coffin in a matter of minutes. The intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically, lethally wrong. Instead of a sleeping terrorist and a handful of guards, Morrison's team had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. 200 Taliban fighters had converged on their position like antibodies attacking an infection. The SEAL team's night vision had revealed muzzle flashes erupting from every building, every rooftop, every shadow in the village of Kamdesh. The mission had become a desperate fight for survival against impossible odds. Morrison's next transmission carried a tremor that years of training couldn't quite suppress. Overwatch, we are taking heavy fire from all directions. Estimate 200 hostiles. We have wounded. Request immediate close air support. Rodriguez felt ice form in his stomach. Close air support meant jets, helicopters, precision munitions. It meant calling down thunder from the sky to save 12 American lives. But at 3:47 hours, the nearest A-10 Warthog was 3 hours away. The nearest Apache gunship was grounded for maintenance. The Quick Reaction Force was committed to another operation 50 kilometers south. The mathematics of war were brutally simple: 12 SEALs versus 200 Taliban fighters. Without air support, those odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. Rodriguez stared at his console, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, 12 of America's finest warriors were counting down the minutes until dawn brought either salvation or slaughter. What Rodriguez didn't know was that salvation would arrive in a form nobody expected. The first hint of dawn was bleeding across the eastern peaks when Captain Valentina Ghost Kozlova received the scramble order. She had been lying on her narrow bunk in the pilot's quarters, staring at a photograph of her daughter Anya, 7 years old, gap-toothed smile, holding a paper airplane they'd folded together during her last leave. The klaxon's wail shattered the silence like artillery fire, sending pilots scrambling toward the flight line where their aircraft waited in the pre-dawn darkness. Ghost moved with practiced efficiency, muscle memory guiding her through the ritual of preparation that had become as natural as breathing. Flight suit, G-suit, helmet, survival vest loaded with enough equipment to keep her alive for 72 hours in hostile territory. She had performed this dance 300 times before, but this morning felt different. The air carried electricity, the particular tension that preceded moments when everything changed. She emerged from the ready room to find her weapons systems officer, Lieutenant Tommy Radar Patterson, already conducting pre-flight checks on their FA-18F Super Hornet. The aircraft crouched on the tarmac like a predator, 48 feet of titanium and carbon fiber engineered for a single purpose: controlled violence delivered with surgical precision. In the darkness, ground crew swarmed around the jet, loading AGM-65 Maverick missiles and checking fuel lines with the choreographed efficiency of a pit crew. "What's the target package?" Ghost asked, accepting her helmet from Patterson. "SEAL team in contact. Heavy. They're requesting danger-close air support in the Helmand Valley." Patterson's voice carried the particular gravity reserved for missions where American lives hung in the balance. Danger close meant delivering ordnance within 600 meters of friendly forces, a margin of error measured in feet rather than miles. Ghost felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the physiological response that preceded combat. Her father had been a MiG-29 pilot for the Soviet Air Force before defecting to the United States in 1989, carrying secrets that had helped end the Cold War. He had taught her that fear was not the enemy, paralysis was. Fear kept pilots alive. Paralysis killed them. She climbed into the cockpit, hands moving automatically through the startup sequence. Engines spooling, avionics online, weapon systems armed. The Super Hornet's twin F414 engines developed 34,000 pounds of thrust, enough to push the aircraft past Mach 1.6. More importantly, they generated enough power to carry 8,000 pounds of precision-guided munitions across 500 miles of Afghan airspace. The tower cleared them for immediate departure. Ghost advanced the throttles, feeling 40,000 pounds of aircraft surge forward into the darkness. The runway lights blurred past her canopy as the Super Hornet accelerated, reaching rotation speed in 12 seconds. She pulled back on the stick, and the earth fell away beneath them. Afghanistan spread out below like a moonscape, all shadows and jagged peaks painted silver by starlight. Somewhere in that wilderness, 12 Americans were fighting for their lives against impossible odds. Ghost pushed the throttles forward, climbing through 30,000 feet as she raced toward coordinates that marked either a rescue or a funeral. The radio chatter in Ghost's headset painted a picture more dire than the initial briefing had suggested. Phantom 6's situation had deteriorated from "in contact" to "surrounded and taking casualties." Morrison's voice, transmitted through layers of encryption and satellite relay, carried the particular strain of a leader watching his men die, while calculating ammunition and counting the minutes until dawn brought either reinforcement or annihilation. "Ghost, this is Phantom 6. We have 2 KIA, 4 WIA, running low on ammunition. Estimate 200 hostiles in defensive positions throughout the village. We need immediate close air support or we're not making it home." Ghost felt the familiar cold focus settle over her consciousness like armor. 2 killed in action. 4 wounded in action. Those weren't statistics. They were husbands, fathers, sons whose families would receive folded flags and hollow condolences. The mathematics of modern warfare reduced human tragedy to radio brevity codes, but Ghost had learned long ago that behind every tactical report lay stories that would never be told. Patterson's voice crackled through the intercom. "Phantom 6, this is Buzzsaw 01. We are 20 minutes out. Can you mark your position?" "Negative on marking. Too much small arms fire. We're in the northwest building of the village, 2 stories, green door. Taliban positions are in every other structure. Danger close authorization granted for anything that moves outside our building." Danger close authorization. Morrison was giving Ghost permission to drop bombs within lethal distance of his own position. It was either the ultimate expression of trust or the desperate calculation of a commander with no other options. Probably both. Ghost studied the infrared display on her multifunction screen, watching heat signatures move through the village like ghosts. The Taliban had turned Kamdesh into a fortress, with fighting positions covering every avenue of approach. The SEALs were trapped in a building, surrounded by 200 enemies who had spent the night maneuvering for the perfect kill shot. The village sat in a valley carved by centuries of glacial runoff, surrounded by ridgelines that channeled wind in unpredictable patterns. Those same ridgelines created dead zones where GPS signals weakened and infrared signatures blurred. Ghost would have one pass, maybe two, before the element of surprise evaporated, and every Taliban fighter in the valley started shooting surface-to-air missiles at her aircraft. "Radar, what's our weapons load?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. 4 AGM-65 Mavericks, 2,000 rounds of 20mm full defensive suite. We're carrying enough firepower to level 6 city blocks, but danger close limits our options. One mistake and we turn those SEALs into pink mist. Ghost nodded, checking her instruments as the Super Hornet sliced through the thin air at 35,000 feet. Mathematics and physics would determine success or failure in the next 10 minutes. Velocity, trajectory, blast radius, fragmentation patterns, variables that would decide whether 12 Americans lived or died. Below them, the Hindu Kush mountains stretched toward the horizon like the vertebrae of some ancient beast. Somewhere in those shadows, 12 warriors were counting ammunition and praying for deliverance. Ghost's radio headset filled with overlapping transmissions as multiple agencies coordinated the developing crisis. The Joint Terminal Attack Controller at FOB Anaconda was attempting to establish communication with a Predator drone orbiting 15 miles south. An Army colonel was demanding updates on the Quick Reaction Force's estimated time of arrival. Air Force controllers were coordinating deconfliction with a medevac helicopter that wouldn't launch until the area was secure. Through the chaos of radio traffic, Morrison's voice cut like a blade. All stations, this is Phantom 6. We have movement on all sides. They're massing for a final assault. If somebody doesn't light up this grid square in the next 5 minutes, we're going to be overrun." The transmission carried a weight that transcended rank and protocol. Morrison wasn't requesting support. He was stating a mathematical certainty. The Taliban had spent 6 hours positioning fighters, ammunition, and crew-served weapons for a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the SEAL team's defensive position. They had transformed patience into tactical advantage, using darkness and terrain to orchestrate what would become either a rescue or a massacre. Ghost checked her navigation display. 12 minutes to target. The Super Hornet was covering ground at 8 miles per minute, but 12 minutes might as well be 12 hours given the deteriorating situation on the ground. She could hear the increasing tempo of small arms fire through Morrison's open microphone, AK-47s chattering in short, disciplined bursts that spoke to professional military training rather than untrained militia. Patterson's voice carried professional calm tinged with underlying tension. "Ghost, I'm seeing multiple heat signatures converging on the target building. Looks like they're positioning for a coordinated assault from 3 directions." The infrared display showed the tactical situation with crystalline clarity. Taliban fighters were moving through the village in teams of 6 to 8 men, using buildings and walls for concealment as they established overlapping fields of fire. The SEAL team's position was becoming the center of a carefully constructed kill zone. Ghost keyed her radio. "Phantom 6, Buzzsaw 01, we have eyes on your position. Confirm friendly location. Northwest building, 2 stories, green door. We have IR strobes on the roof, but we can't activate them without drawing fire. You're going to have to make this work without visual confirmation." No IR strobes meant no electronic identification of friendly positions. Ghost would have to rely on coordinates, terrain association, and her own judgment to distinguish between American warriors and Taliban fighters, separated by perhaps 50 meters of ancient stone and modern hatred. The weight of responsibility settled across her shoulders like a mantle, 12 lives hanging in the balance, one chance to get it right. The first challenge became immediately apparent as Ghost descended through 20,000 feet. The weather was deteriorating faster than meteorological reports had predicted. What had been forecast as scattered clouds and light winds had evolved into a winter storm system, pulling moisture up from the Arabian Sea. The Super Hornet shuddered through layers of turbulence that made precise targeting exponentially more difficult. Buzzsaw 01, this is Overlord. Be advised, weather cell moving through your area of operations. Winds gusting to 45 knots with horizontal visibility dropping to 2 miles in snow showers. Ghost felt the aircraft buffet as she descended through 15,000 feet. The Super Hornet's advanced fly-by-wire systems automatically compensating for wind shear that would have been lethal to earlier generation aircraft. The weapons systems required stable flight parameters for accurate delivery. Trying to drop precision munitions in a windstorm was like performing surgery during an earthquake. Patterson's voice carried concern that years of training couldn't quite mask. Ghost, the targeting pod is having trouble maintaining lock in these conditions. We're getting intermittent signatures, but nothing solid enough for a weapons release. Through her helmet-mounted display, Ghost could see the village of Kamdesh materializing through the storm like something from a fever dream. Ancient stone buildings clung to mountainsides carved by centuries of wind and water, connected by narrow streets that had witnessed the passage of armies from Alexander the Great to the Soviet Union, to the current conflict that had no name and no discernible end. The Taliban had chosen their battlefield well. The village's location in a narrow valley created natural choke points that limited aircraft maneuverability. The stone buildings provided excellent cover from aerial attack, while offering multiple firing positions for small arms and rocket-propelled grenades. Most importantly, the proximity of civilian structures to military targets created legal and moral complexities that could paralyze even the most experienced pilots. But Ghost wasn't most pilots. Morrison's voice crackled through the static. Buzzsaw 01, they're moving on us. I can see muzzle flashes from every direction. We need ordnance on target now, or this becomes a recovery mission instead of a rescue. A recovery mission, military euphemism for collecting bodies instead of saving lives. Ghost felt ice form in her stomach as she processed the tactical situation. The Taliban were executing a textbook assault. Suppressive fire from multiple directions to fix the SEAL team in place, followed by concentrated assault from the most advantageous angle. Professional, disciplined, and probably successful given the numerical advantage. Unless someone changed the mathematics of the engagement. Ghost pushed the Super Hornet into a steep dive, descending through the storm like a falling star wrapped in titanium and determination. The targeting system struggled to maintain lock through the weather, but her eyes, trained through thousands of hours of combat flying, could distinguish between the heat signatures of American warriors and Taliban fighters based on movement patterns, spacing, and tactical discipline. The village rushed toward her canopy at 300 knots. The first weapon she selected was a AGM-65 Maverick missile, a precision-guided munition designed for exactly this scenario. The Maverick's infrared seeker could distinguish between a Taliban fighter and a SEAL team member based on thermal signature and movement patterns, assuming the weather didn't interfere with target acquisition. Ghost designated the largest concentration of enemy fighters, a building 200 meters east of the SEAL position, where muzzle flashes indicated a crew-served weapon. Phantom 6 Buzzsaw 01, missile inbound on the building with the machine gun, 30 seconds. The Maverick dropped from the Super Hornet's wing pylon like a mechanical falcon, its seeker head immediately locking onto the thermal signature of the Taliban position. Ghost banked hard left, using the aircraft's agility to avoid potential surface-to-air missiles while maintaining visual contact with the target area. The missile streaked through the storm, its guidance system making minute corrections for wind and atmospheric conditions. The explosion lit up the valley like a miniature sun, the AGM-65's warhead delivering 300 pounds of focused destruction into the building's second floor. Secondary explosions indicated the detonation of stored ammunition, probably mortars or rocket-propelled grenades that the Taliban had stockpiled for their assault. The machine gun fell silent. Patterson's voice carried professional satisfaction. Direct hit, multiple secondary explosions. That position is neutralized. But one building destroyed left 7 more Taliban positions still active, still coordinating fires on the pinned SEAL team. Ghost could see muzzle flashes erupting from windows and doorways throughout the village as enemy fighters realized they were now facing both ground-based resistance and air attack. The tactical situation was evolving from siege to chaos, exactly what Ghost needed. Phantom 6, what's your status? Morrison's voice carried exhaustion and determination in equal measure. Good hit, Buzzsaw. That bought us some breathing room, but we still have hostiles in the buildings to our south and west. They're repositioning for another assault. Ghost studied the infrared display, watching heat signatures move through the village with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers. These weren't untrained militia fighters. They were disciplined troops executing coordinated battle drills under fire. The Taliban had evolved considerably since the early days of the conflict, incorporating lessons learned from 15 years of asymmetric warfare against the world's most advanced military, which meant Ghost would have to evolve as well. The second target was a 3-story building that housed what appeared to be a Taliban command post, based on the concentration of personnel and the lack of visible weapons fire. Command posts were priority targets in any engagement. Destroying the enemy's ability to coordinate attacks was often more valuable than eliminating individual fighting positions. Ghost designated the building with her targeting pod, but the weather was making precision difficult. Radar, I need you to talk me onto target. Weather's degrading our systems. Patterson became her eyes in the storm, calling out corrections based on radar returns and infrared signatures barely visible through the snow and wind. Come left 5 degrees. Target building is the tallest structure, 3 stories, flat roof with antenna array. Ghost rolled the Super Hornet into a shallow dive, descending through 8,000 feet as she aligned for her second weapons pass. The anti-aircraft threat was minimal. Taliban forces in this region typically relied on small arms and rocket-propelled grenades rather than sophisticated surface-to-air missiles. But flying low and slow in a narrow valley still carried enormous risk. One lucky shot from an AK-47 could puncture a fuel line or damage flight controls. She squeezed the trigger, releasing a second Maverick missile toward the command post. The weapon's infrared seeker locked onto the building's thermal signature despite the deteriorating weather conditions. Ghost pulled into a climbing turn, using the terrain for masking as the missile impacted with devastating precision. The explosion collapsed half the building, sending stone and timber cascading into the narrow street below. More importantly, it severed the Taliban's command and control network. Ghost could see the tactical effects immediately. The coordinated movement of fighters became confused, individual, reactive rather than disciplined and synchronized. But 12 SEALs were still surrounded by nearly 200 enemy fighters, and Ghost was down to 2 missiles and her 20 cannon. The mathematics of the engagement were still brutally unforgiving. Morrison's voice cut through the static with news that changed everything. Buzzsaw 01, we have movement in the northwest corner of the village. Large group of hostiles massing for what looks like a final assault. We're down to our last magazines. Ghost banked the Super Hornet hard left, pulling 4 GS as she positioned for a visual on the northwest sector. Through the storm and darkness, she could see heat signatures moving with purpose, Taliban fighters abandoning concealment in favor of concentrated firepower. They were gambling everything on a single overwhelming assault designed to overrun the SEAL position before additional air support could arrive. It was a sound tactical decision, that would probably succeed. The concentration of enemy forces presented both opportunity and enormous risk. Ghost could devastate the assault force with her remaining weapons, but the Taliban fighters were moving through terrain that placed them dangerously close to civilian structures. A single navigation error or weapons malfunction could transform a precision strike into an international incident. Patterson's voice carried tension that training couldn't suppress. Ghost, I'm showing 40-plus heat signatures moving toward the SEAL position. They'll reach the building in less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes. Ghost had 3 minutes to prevent a massacre, using 2 missiles and a cannon against an enemy force that had spent hours preparing for this moment. The tactical situation demanded impossible precision, delivered under impossible conditions, by a pilot whose margin for error was measured in meters rather than miles. She selected her third Maverick missile and designated the center of the advancing formation. The weapon would need to detonate at precisely the right moment to maximize casualties, while minimizing collateral damage to nearby structures. Ghost held her breath as the missile dropped from its pylon, streaking through the storm toward coordinates that would determine whether 12 Americans lived or died. The explosion erupted in the center of the Taliban formation like a deadly flower, sending bodies and equipment tumbling across the ancient stone streets. But Ghost could see immediately that the strike, while devastating, hadn't broken the assault. Surviving fighters continued advancing toward the SEAL position with grim determination. Phantom 6, I need immediate battle damage assessment. Morrison's response carried exhaustion and professional admiration. Outstanding work, Buzzsaw. You broke their assault, but we still have hostiles moving on our position. Maybe 20 fighters left, but they're determined. 20 fighters. Ghost had 1 missile remaining and her 20 cannon, sufficient firepower to neutralize the remaining threat if she could deliver it with surgical precision. But the weather was worsening, the terrain was unforgiving, and the margin for error had shrunk to nothing. She armed her final Maverick missile and began her approach. The fourth and final missile represented Ghost's last chance to tip the tactical balance decisively in favor of the surrounded SEAL team. She had identified a building that appeared to house the largest remaining concentration of Taliban fighters, a 2-story structure with thick stone walls that provided excellent protection from small arms fire, but would channel the blast effects of a precision munition with devastating efficiency. Patterson's voice guided her through the targeting process. Building is 200 meters southwest of friendly position. I'm seeing 12 to 15 heat signatures, probably the core leadership element trying to coordinate the final assault. Ghost studied the infrared display, noting the disciplined spacing and defensive positions that indicated professional military training. These weren't desperate fighters making a last stand. They were experienced soldiers executing a tactical withdrawal that would allow them to regroup and continue the assault from a more advantageous position. Unless she stopped them. The Super Hornet shuddered through another gust of wind as Ghost refined her attack angle, calculating blast radius against friendly positions with mathematical precision that would have impressed her aerospace engineering professors. The margin for error was 12 meters, the difference between saving the SEAL team and accidentally killing them with friendly fire. Phantom 6, final missile inbound. Recommend you take cover. Morrison's response was immediate. Roger, Buzzsaw. All Phantom elements get down and stay down. Ghost squeezed the trigger, releasing her final Maverick missile toward coordinates that represented either salvation or catastrophe. The weapon dropped from its pylon with mechanical precision, its guidance system already adapting to wind conditions and atmospheric interference as it streaked toward the target building. The explosion illuminated the entire valley, the warhead's detonation collapsing the building's second floor and sending debris cascading across the narrow street. Ghost could see the tactical effects immediately. The organized movement of Taliban fighters dissolved into chaos as their final assault element was eliminated. But the engagement wasn't over. Patterson's voice carried urgency. "Ghost, I'm still seeing movement in the southern sector. Looks like a dozen fighters trying to flank the SEAL position." Ghost was out of missiles. Her only remaining weapon was the Super Hornet's M61A1 Vulcan cannon, a six-barreled Gatling gun that fired 20 depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. The weapon was devastatingly effective against personnel and light vehicles, but it required close-range engagement that would expose the aircraft to ground fire. She pushed the Super Hornet into a diving attack, descending through 3,000 feet as she lined up on the moving Taliban fighters. The cannon's targeting system struggled to maintain lock on individual personnel through the storm, forcing Ghost to rely on visual identification and instinctive marksmanship developed through years of combat experience. The first strafing run erupted across the village like controlled lightning, 20 rounds chewing through stone walls and wooden doors with equal ease. Ghost could see Taliban fighters scattering for cover as depleted uranium penetrators turned ancient masonry into lethal fragments. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio with something approaching amazement. "Buzzsaw 01, that was beautiful. You just saved our lives." But Ghost wasn't finished. The final phase of the engagement required a level of precision flying that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their absolute limits. Ghost had identified the last significant Taliban position, a building that housed snipers who had been engaging the SEAL team with disciplined, accurate fire throughout the 6-hour siege. Eliminating them would break the remaining enemy resistance and allow the SEALs to establish a defensive perimeter until reinforcements arrived. The building sat at the edge of the village, partially concealed by terrain features that made a direct attack extremely difficult. Ghost would need to execute a diving attack through a narrow valley, deliver precise cannon fire, and execute an immediate climbing turn to avoid controlled flight into terrain. The maneuver was technically possible, but operationally dangerous, the kind of flying that separated exceptional pilots from dead pilots. Patterson's voice carried concern that transcended professional protocol. "Ghost, that's an extremely tight approach. Terrain on both sides, weather degrading, and we're getting low on fuel." Ghost checked her fuel gauge, confirming Patterson's assessment. The Super Hornet had enough aviation gasoline for one final attack run and the flight back to base, assuming everything went perfectly. Combat flying consumed fuel at exponential rates, and the multiple high-G maneuvers had drained their reserves faster than planned. But 12 Americans were still in mortal danger, and Ghost had never abandoned a mission. She rolled the Super Hornet into a steep dive, descending through the storm like a mechanical raptor hunting prey. The narrow valley channeled wind into unpredictable currents that buffeted the aircraft, forcing Ghost to make constant corrections to maintain her attack heading. The sniper position grew larger in her targeting reticle as she closed to effective cannon range. At 800 meters, she squeezed the trigger. The Vulcan cannon erupted in a continuous stream of destruction, 20 rounds impacting the building with devastating precision. Stone walls disintegrated under the assault, wooden support beams splintered into fragments, and the entire structure collapsed in a cascade of rubble and dust. The sniper position was eliminated. Ghost pulled into a climbing turn, the Super Hornet's engines straining against gravity and atmospheric density as she gained altitude. Behind her, the village of Kamdesh burned in scattered fires that painted the storm clouds in shades of orange and red. The tactical situation had been reversed. 12 SEALs had survived against impossible odds, and nearly 200 Taliban fighters had been killed, wounded, or scattered into the mountains. The mathematics of modern warfare had been overturned by superior training, advanced technology, and the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in flight school. Morrison's voice carried exhaustion, relief, and profound gratitude. Buzzsaw 01, this is Phantom 6. Village is secure. All hostiles eliminated or withdrawn. You just saved 12 American lives. Ghost felt tension drain from her shoulders as she set course for home, the Super Hornet climbing through the storm toward clear skies and safety. Below them, the Hindu Kush Mountains stretched toward the horizon like ancient monuments to human endurance and the eternal struggle between civilization and chaos. But the mission wasn't complete until every American warrior reached friendly territory. The flight back to Fob Anaconda gave Ghost time to process what had just occurred in the narrow valley that few people would ever visit and fewer would remember. She had delivered 4 precision missiles and multiple cannon runs under combat conditions that tested every system on the aircraft and every skill she had developed through 15 years of military flying. The margin for error had been measured in meters, the consequences of failure measured in American lives. Patterson's voice broke the contemplative silence. Ghost, I've never seen flying like that. The approach angles you used, the precision under those weather conditions, that was exceptional. Ghost didn't respond immediately. Her attention focused on the instrument panel as she monitored engine temperatures and fuel consumption during the return flight. The Super Hornet had performed flawlessly despite being pushed to operational limits that exceeded design specifications. Modern military aircraft were engineering marvels, but they still required human judgment and skill to transform technological capability into tactical success. The radio crackled with confirmation that the SEAL team was secure and preparing for extraction. A quick reaction force was finally approaching their position, 45 minutes too late to affect the outcome, but perfectly timed to provide security for the helicopter that would carry Morrison's team back to safety. The tactical situation had stabilized, the immediate crisis resolved through violence delivered with surgical precision. But Ghost understood that this mission would generate consequences extending far beyond the village of Kamdesh. The Taliban leadership would analyze every aspect of the engagement, learning lessons that would influence future operations. Intelligence agencies would dissect radio intercepts and battlefield forensics to understand enemy capabilities and intentions. Military historians would study the tactical decisions that transformed a potential massacre into a successful rescue. Most importantly, 12 American families would receive phone calls confirming that their loved ones were alive, rather than telegrams announcing their deaths. The mathematics of modern warfare were ultimately human equations dressed in technological complexity. Advanced aircraft, precision weapons, and sophisticated communications networks were tools that amplified human decision-making rather than replacing it. The difference between success and failure remained the quality of individuals trained to make impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. Ghost guided the Super Hornet through the pre-dawn darkness, following navigation waypoints toward an airbase that represented safety, fuel, and maintenance, the logistical foundation that enabled tactical success thousands of miles from American soil. Behind her, the Hindu Kush Mountains receded into darkness, carrying secrets that would remain buried in ancient stone and modern silence. The landing at Fob Anaconda occurred without incident, the Super Hornet touching down on a runway carved from Afghan desert through the determination of military engineers who had transformed wilderness into functional airbase. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, conducting post-flight inspections that would determine whether the jet was ready for another mission or required maintenance that could take days or weeks. Ghost climbed from the cockpit feeling the particular exhaustion that followed combat flying, a combination of physical fatigue, emotional drain, and adrenaline crash that no amount of training could entirely prepare pilots to manage. Her flight suit was soaked with perspiration despite the sub-zero temperatures at altitude, her hands trembling slightly from the sustained concentration required for precision weapons delivery under combat conditions. Patterson emerged from the rear cockpit with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with something approaching awe. "Ghost, I've flown with some exceptional pilots, but what you did tonight was beyond exceptional. That was artistry." Artistry. Ghost had never considered combat flying as art, but perhaps Patterson was correct. The integration of human skill with mechanical precision, the transformation of physics and mathematics into tactical advantage, the creation of order from chaos through disciplined application of violence. These were elements that transcended mere technical competence. The debrief would wait until after sunrise, allowing intelligence analysts and mission commanders to process the tactical reports and radio intercepts that would provide context for the night's events. For now, Ghost needed coffee, food, and the kind of silence that allowed combat pilots to process experiences that civilian psychologists struggled to understand. She walked across the flight line toward the pilot's quarters, passing aircraft and equipment that represented billions of dollars in military investment deployed in support of objectives that remained frustratingly unclear after 15 years of continuous conflict. The contradiction between technological sophistication and strategic ambiguity was one of the defining characteristics of modern warfare. The ability to win tactical engagements while struggling to achieve strategic objectives. But tactical victories mattered when they were measured in American lives saved rather than territory conquered. Morrison's SEAL team would return to their families because of decisions made and actions taken during 6 hours of darkness in a valley that most Americans couldn't locate on a map. The strategic implications were debatable, but the human mathematics were absolute. Ghost reached her quarters as the first hint of dawn began to illuminate the eastern peaks of the Hindu Kush. Somewhere in those mountains, Taliban fighters were retreating to sanctuaries that had provided refuge for armies and empires across centuries of conflict. They would regroup, rearm, and resume operations with the patience that characterized insurgent warfare. And Ghost would be ready when they did. The debriefing session convened at 1400 hours in a conference room that smelled of strong coffee and the particular tension that accompanied post-mission analysis. Colonel Marcus Steele Henderson presided over the gathering with the methodical precision that had earned him a reputation as one of the Air Force's most demanding but effective wing commanders. Around the table sat intelligence analysts, mission planners, and combat pilots whose collective experience represented decades of warfare in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations that would never appear in official histories. Ghost took her seat across from a plasma screen displaying satellite imagery of the Kamdesh Valley, the previous night's battle damage clearly visible in high-resolution photographs that revealed the devastating effectiveness of precision airstrikes. 4 buildings had been completely destroyed, 3 others showed significant damage, and crater patterns indicated the locations where her cannon runs had eliminated Taliban fighting positions. Colonel Henderson opened the session with characteristic directness. "Ladies and gentlemen, last night's operation represents one of the most successful close air support missions in recent memory. 12 SEALs surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces, extracted without casualties, enemy strength estimated at 70% destroyed or dispersed. Captain Kozlova, walk us through your tactical decision-making process." Ghost stood, activating a laser pointer that highlighted specific targets on the satellite imagery. "Sir, the weather conditions required constant adaptation of standard close air support procedures. Infrared targeting was compromised by atmospheric interference, GPS accuracy was degraded by terrain masking, and wind conditions exceeded optimal parameters for precision weapons delivery." She clicked to the next slide, showing gun camera footage from her first missile attack. Initial target selection focused on crew-served weapons that posed the greatest immediate threat to friendly forces. The machine gun position in Building Alpha was eliminated with a single AGM-65 Maverick, resulting in secondary explosions that indicated significant ammunition storage. Major Lisa Chen, the wing's intelligence officer, interrupted with a question that carried implications beyond tactical analysis. Captain, intelligence reports suggest the Taliban force at Kamdesh included foreign fighters with advanced training. Did you observe any evidence of sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons or coordinated air defense measures? Ghost considered the question carefully, aware that her response would influence future mission planning and force protection measures. Ma'am, enemy small arms fire was disciplined and accurate, suggesting professional military training rather than militia capabilities. However, I observed no evidence of surface-to-air missiles or coordinated air defense systems. The Taliban fighters relied on concealment and terrain masking rather than active electronic countermeasures. The briefing continued for 90 minutes, with analysts dissecting every aspect of the engagement from weapons effectiveness to communications protocols. Each detail would be incorporated into lessons learned that would influence training programs, tactical procedures, and equipment modifications for pilots who would face similar situations in future operations. But the most important statistic was elegantly simple. 12 American warriors had returned home alive because of decisions made and actions taken during 6 hours of darkness in a valley that history